They told you beef contains 26 grams of protein per 100 grams. They told you that makes it essential. They didn't tell you about the seed that delivers 14 grams of complete protein in the same serving, requires no refrigeration, grows in drought, stores for decades, and was classified as a weapon by an empire that needed you dependent on their supply chain. This is amaranth. You were taught to call it a superfood trend. Civilizations that fed armies with it for 8,000 years called it survival. The Aztec Empire maintained administrative records on amate bark paper. Those records, preserved in the Codex Mendoza and Florentine Codex, document amaranth grain tributes measured in standardized units called quachtli. Each quachtli represented approximately 120 liters of grain. Tributary provinces delivered between 10 and 20 quachtli of amaranth annually to Tenochtitlan. This was not ceremonial. This was logistics. Amaranth comprised an estimated 20 to 30% of the Aztec caloric base, alongside maize and beans. It was ground into flour, mixed with honey or blood, compressed into portable blocks called tsoali, and distributed to military units during campaigns. The grain provided energy density, required no cooking, resisted spoilage in tropical heat, and restored quickly after consumption. Warriors carried it in woven pouches. Rulers distributed it during famine. The system functioned for centuries because the crop required minimal water, thrived in poor soil, and produced seeds within 90 days of planting. The Inca cultivated a regional variant called kiwicha at altitudes above 3,000 meters, where wheat cannot establish root systems. Archaeological evidence from terraces near Machu Picchu shows amaranth grown alongside quinoa in soil too thin for European grains. The plant tolerates frost, drought, and saline conditions. It completes its life cycle in environments where most seed crops fail. These were not marginal lands. These were the only lands available. Empires did not build on fertility. They built on what could be made fertile. Amaranth allowed that conversion. Chinese records from the Ming Dynasty describe amaranth cultivation during the reign of the Hongwu Emperor, 14 to 15 centuries ago, categorized as a famine grain stored in provincial granaries. The grain was not eaten daily. It was eaten when rice failed, but it was always there. The crop itself functions as a closed system. One amaranth plant produces between 40,000 and 60,000 seeds. Each seed measures 1 millimeter in diameter. A single gram contains approximately 1,000 seeds. Planting density ranges from 10 to 15 plants per square meter. Harvest yield averages 500 to 1,000 kilograms per hectare under minimal irrigation. The plant develops a deep taproot that extracts moisture below the surface layer, where other crops die. Leaves are edible and contain more iron than spinach. Seeds contain all 9 essential amino acids, including lysine, which is deficient in wheat and maize. This makes amaranth protein comparable to animal protein in biological utilization. The human body can synthesize muscle tissue from amaranth without supplementary inputs. That is the definition of a complete protein. Beef provides it. Amaranth provides it without the cow. Storage determines survival when supply chains break. Amaranth seeds remain viable for 4 to 5 years in ambient conditions without processing. In cool, dry storage, viability extends beyond 10 years. The seed coat resists moisture and insect penetration. No refrigeration required. No chemical preservatives required. During the siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521, Spanish forces under Hernán Cortés severed causeways and blockaded the city for 93 days. Aztec reserves included amaranth stored in above-ground granaries. Spanish accounts describe these reserves as substantial enough to sustain the population despite the siege. The city fell not because food ran out, but because freshwater aqueducts were destroyed and disease spread through the population. When the Spanish entered, they found grain stores intact. They also found a population that had structured its agriculture around resilience, not yield. That model was incompatible with colonial extraction. Compare the inputs. Beef production requires 15,000 liters of water per kilogram of meat. Amaranth requires between 200 and 500 liters per kilogram of grain, depending on climate. Beef requires approximately 25 kilograms of feed grain to produce 1 kilogram of meat. Amaranth produces seed directly for human consumption. 1 hectare of grazing land supports enough cattle to produce 50 kilograms of beef annually. 1 hectare of amaranth produces between 500 and 1,000 kilograms of edible seed annually. The protein per hectare from amaranth is 10 to 15 times higher than beef, with a fraction of the water and 0 external feed inputs. These are not estimates. These are agronomic measurements repeated across climates from Mexico to India to Kenya. The numbers do not change. The crop performs regardless of industrial infrastructure. Modern research confirms what empires knew empirically. A 2005 study published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry analyzed amaranth protein composition and found bioavailability scores comparable to casein, the reference protein derived from milk. The study identified peptides with antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. A 2013 study in Plant Foods for Human Nutrition demonstrated that amaranth consumption reduced LDL cholesterol in clinical trials. The grain contains squalene, a compound typically extracted from shark liver, which supports immune function and cellular repair. Nutritional science spent decades rediscovering what Aztec physicians embedded in their agricultural system. The knowledge was not lost. It was buried under a classification system that designated amaranth as primitive and beef as advanced. The reclassification began in 1521 and formalized over the next century. Spanish colonial authorities issued decrees prohibiting amaranth cultivation on the grounds that it was used in religious ceremonies involving human sacrifice. The ceremonies existed. The grain existed independently, but the association allowed legal suppression. Land grants awarded to Spanish settlers required the cultivation of European crops, wheat, barley, and livestock pasture. Indigenous farmers who continued planting amaranth faced land confiscation. The economic model was deliberate. European crops required metal plows, which required blacksmiths. They required irrigation systems, which required engineers. They required mills, which required capital investment. Amaranth required a hole in the ground and rain. A population that could feed itself with handfuls of seed stored in clay pots did not need supply chains. It did not need merchants. It did not need the systems that made colonial economies function. So the seed was classified as backwards, pagan, and inferior. The classification persisted for 400 years. The same pattern appears across continents. Fonio in West Africa, another ancient grain with complete protein and drought resistance, was marginalized in favor of imported rice. Teff in Ethiopia, the base of injera flatbread for 3,000 years, remains classified as niche despite outperforming wheat in water efficiency. Breadfruit in the Pacific, capable of feeding populations with minimal labor, was dismissed as a lazy crop by colonial administrators who needed populations working on sugar plantations, not eating from trees. Each case follows the same structure. A crop that enables autonomy is reclassified as primitive. A crop that requires infrastructure is classified as civilized. The economy follows the classification. The diet follows the economy. Within 2 generations, the population forgets what their ancestors ate. Projections for 2050 estimate that 2/3 of current agricultural land will face water stress severe enough to reduce yields of water-intensive crops by 30 to 50%. Wheat requires 450 liters of water per kilogram. Rice requires 2,000 liters per kilogram. Beef requires 15,000 liters per kilogram. Amaranth requires 250 liters per kilogram and grows in saline soil where desertification has already begun. The International Panel on Climate Change Agricultural Models identified drought-resistant crops as critical to food security in the next 3 decades. Amaranth appears in those models. It appears as an alternative. It should appear as the foundation. The infrastructure built around water-intensive crops is collapsing under its own resource demands. The seed that thrives in scarcity is still sold in health food stores at $12 per pound, while governments subsidize the production of beef that requires 40 times the water to deliver the same protein. The vault does not advocate. It reveals. Amaranth was not forgotten. It was removed. The removal was systematic, economic, and designed to replace autonomous food systems with dependent ones. The seed still grows. It grows in India, China, Peru, Kenya, and the southwestern United States. It has always grown. But you were never told it could replace the meat on your plate with a handful of grains planted in a window box. You were told it was a trend. Trends end. Survival systems endure. The amaranth your ancestors stored in clay jars is the same seed sold as a superfood in plastic bags. The reclassification changed the price. It did not change the plant. If this vault revealed something they tried to erase, subscribe to preserve what history tried to bury. Knowledge only survives when it is remembered. The next vault opens soon.